A lot of familiar faces, so I won't spend too much time introducing myself. The way I
I
view
won't either.
this is about
It's
a
gonna be the same
9
old
or
stuff.
10 hour
Be playing Tetris, trying to get a win. Listening to Terrence
of us all
McKenna,
to each other,
wax poetic.
and it's too short a time to
So yeah, if you stop by, welcome
teach an
and
orthodox ethnobotany class
say
or
what
even
up.
a survey course in ethnobotany. But it's longer than the normal
this is a new setup.
hour or 2 hour
I'm testing
talk
basically my stream
questions
again
that I
to see if
give.
it's still working
So
well,
I'm
because I haven't
hopeful
used it
that
in
there
a
will be a
while.
lot of interaction,
Terrence, shut up.
and that you've come prepared with questions, and that you have special interests that we can develop.
So I can finish saying what I was gonna say. What the fuck was I gonna say? Jesus Christ. I was gonna say. Oh, I'm testing this stream because I think I'm gonna be switching to a different streaming service. Not a big deal. It's not because I didn't have much of a following, but in case anybody's wondering, just so I'm not dealing with Amazon anymore, because they own Twitch. So yeah, I'd like to curtail my use of Amazon and their services as much as possible. So yeah, I'm gonna be looking for a new place to stream, I guess, so I can get back into it as well. Yeah, because why not? I don't have a job again, and fuck it. Gives me something to do. We'll see. And so yeah, that's what's going on with me and making misdrops already. Don't you worry. We will make it back. Ah, look at that. Another opportunity for a T-spin just manifested itself because we believed. And I believe Terrence McKenna is very interesting, so I'll start that back up
as we go along.
And shut up and play fucking Tetris.
It would be possible for me to simply teach this like a survey course and explain to you the state of the various disciplines which bear on ethnobotany and ethnopsychopharmacology and shamanism. But I think it would be more useful if I stated my own bias and then sort of presented the information from that point of view. Because the people who have created the modern science of ethnobotany really didn't intend to do so. It's one of these hybrid sciences like folk taxonomy, ethnobotany, that arise when one discipline seems to overlap into another, so that no real firm foundation for thinking about what ethnobotany and ethnopsychiatry, what these things really are, was ever laid. And I think, by way of sort of a preliminary suggestion
I'll
as
pause
to how
if I
that
have a
might
good thing to
work,
talk about so I can talk.
that we have to think about two factors
But I got nothing
form
right now.
human populations and human experience generally. And these are geography, which creates the context in which we find ourselves, and language, with which we create the context we would wish to be in. So we sort of are bound by geography, but freed by language.
Not like anybody's here anyway.
And
no biggie.
This has led to very interesting situations. The geographical and biogeographical facts which lie behind a given area are not very frequently present in the minds of anthropologists or even botanists who investigate these areas. For instance, two portions of the Earth's surface that I have familiarity with are Malaysia
See, I think
and
I don't know. I
Indonesia
might just be
and
rusty,
the Amazon basin. And these are two very
but
different kind of situations.
I feel
What
like
you have with
the competition is ramped up since the last time
Indonesia
I was
is the
really into the
abutting of
Tetris for
a
some reason.
shallow ancient continent
I don't know.
against the Eurasian
Could be imagining it.
landmass,
Um,
so that at the place in Thailand called the Isthmus of Kra, what you actually can see there is the migration of Eurasian species and
don't screw me.
Austral-Indian
Ah, God damn
species
it! I screwed me.
across a migratory line. So there's an intermixing of flora and fauna at
Bullshit.
that point. The
All right, I'm going silent.
number
Listen
of
to T-Mac.
species in an ecology is directly related to the utilizability of the environment by human populations, and this is true of foods as well as drugs and poisons and other kinds of intoxicants. So that there are two situations in which you get ultra-dense speciation. Continental land masses which have been above water for very long periods of time, so that evolution has gone on uninterrupted by catastrophism. And the two most obvious examples that biogeographers study are the Madagascan, oh thank you, the Madagascan land mass, which includes Seychelles and Madagascar and portions of India, and the South American continent. The South American continent has been above water about 120 million years. So that's 120 million years of continuous speciation at the equator. So there's an extremely dense number of species there, sometimes up to several thousand per square mile. And this is a situation that you don't get in the temperate zone. Temperate zone forests tend to be monocultural and have a low species density. Sometimes, for instance, the Canadian forest is comprised by about 20 species. This is why the
animals or plants?
plants, no, plants, climaxed so-called tundra forest is a very so-called monocultural climax. Brian, could I ask you to go to the car and get the big box which is in the back of the Chevy? It's parked down the street a mile. If you could bring the whole thing, that would make it easier.
I don't know
So
why that
this
was
is the
funny to people.
situation that you start out with, is these intense interrelationships between human beings and plants require species-dense floral environments to get going. Now the situation, the reason there's a species-dense environment in Paramalaya, as it's called, is because two continents are colliding there, and the species from both sides are drifting and intermingling, so that in Malaysia, even though it's a small landmass, not a continental landmass, you get a very dense speciation. You see, all of Indonesia was once a continent called Sundaland, very recently, in fact, perhaps as recently as a couple of million years ago. And then with the rise of the sea, this continent was turned into a series of islands, and speciation proceeded on each island according to the constraints of that particular ecosystem. And with the rising and falling of the sea level and the islanding and reuniting of different land masses over several cycles of glacial melt, it acted as a pump for evolution, and you see a fantastic species density there as well. So for people interested in the ethnobotany of hallucinogens, this poses a problem because the distribution of hallucinogens is very lopsided in favor of the New World. In other words, of 800,000, more or less, angiosperms that have been classified, only 20 or so are major hallucinogens, even though several thousand contain psychodynamic alkaloids of one sort or another. But the problems which interfere in their utilization range from low concentration to coincidental appearance with a toxic compound of some sort. This is why, and there are borderline cases, drugs where a hallucinogen will occur with a toxic or emetic compound, but has still been utilized culturally. For instance, morning glory seeds are a good example of that. The seeds of Ipomaea purpura, which is a New World convolvulaceous climber, a morning glory, contain compounds which are related to LSD, but active in a magnitude larger dose. But also coincident with this compound occurs ester coumarin, which is a very strong emetic, makes you vomit. So folk utilization of these morning glories had to develop a way to separate these things out. And this is one of the issues that ethnobotanists have to grapple with, and students of culture generally, which is, how has it happened that these plant interactions have been discovered and utilized by people? And it isn't only plant interactions, it's strange dyeing, I mean, not only drug interactions, it's strange dyeing technologies, technologies for etching metal, technologies for curing wounds. How did they know what to do with each particular plant? For instance, a case about which we'll hear a lot this weekend, because I will talk about it, and tomorrow my brother will come in and talk about it as well, is this drug complex in South America called ayahuasca, where two plants are brought together, neither of which is particularly active by itself, but together they utilize the pharmacological principle of monoamine oxidase inhibition and create a powerful hallucinogen. So when you go into the field, you have to bear in mind the background geography, thank you, of the situation. For instance, the Amazon situation is unique on the planet. The Amazon is the largest river in the world. It's estimated that 20 to 30% of the world's oxygen is being generated by those forests. And yet, the Amazon is a river which once flowed the opposite direction. Before the
really shit the bed there at the end,
of the African and South American continent, 200.
I really shit the bed at the end there. It was less than ideal. I guess I'm interested to see who knocked me out.
A portion of Gondwana land. Is that right? I think so. And it emptied into the Pacific Ocean. And then when the continents separated, there was subduction of the Nazca Plate under the South American continent, and the entire continent shifted very, very slightly.
I'm only kidding. I hold no ill will towards
this slight shift
anybody who
was
beats me
enough
in
to
Tetris.
reverse
I
the
promise.
flow of the river. And then, of course,
Nor
the
do I think
Andes
myself
rose,
better than you
and they're
if I
still
knock you out or beat
rising.
you.
And so
Just wanted to make that clear.
Ecological catastrophe, if you wish, looms very large in looking at the way species were distributed through the Amazon. Now, all these things went on long, long before the advent of man, but they explain the species distribution, the situation as human beings found it when they entered the New World. And when that happened, and the dates now are very controversial, with the most radical people saying that it was up to 2 million years ago, which is considered absolutely unsupportable by the mainstream anthropological opinion, which thinks, that a date of 60,000 years is very high. But whatever happened, it appears that people entered the Amazon both by the Caribbean islands, by radiation which came down across North America through Florida, through the Caribbean islands. There's one school that believes that Mexico was actually repopulated from the south, that the wave of migration was a great hook passing through the Caribbean and then up the Amazon. But there's very little data, so that there are many competing schools about the history of early man in the Amazon. The point of view I just stated is that of this geographer Donald Lathrop, who studied the languages in the basin and concluded that based on the way cognates proliferate, the languages must have been carried from the mouths of the rivers up to the headwaters. Previous to that, the anthropological theory that held was that large human populations could not arise in the rainforest, and that civilization in South America was largely a montane phenomenon. The Incas and the San Augustine cultures, and these cultures building always in the Andes, and that when people moved into the jungle, they essentially were subsumed and lost identifiable material culture, which is what the archaeologist is tracing these things by. Now it's not clear. Recent discoveries with side-ranging radar in the Yucatan showed that there, which is of course not South America but Mexico, but that there the Maya had very large areas under cultivation with systems of earthenwork dams and irrigation channels, which allowed them a much greater carrying capacity for their civilization than had previously been suggested for them. This same sort of thing may have existed in the Amazon, but the evidence for it may be much harder to come by, because the rivers are shifting so much, because the river changes its course so often. I mean, when you fly over the basin, you see rivers that cannot find their way, rivers that loop hundreds of miles back upon themselves, rivers that, as they meander on each side of them, there are hundreds of what are called oxbow lakes, which are essentially thrown out crescent-shaped arms of the river that have then been left. Because the Andes are a young mountain chain, earthquakes are frequent. I mean, I've not spent years in the Amazon, and I've experienced several earthquakes. And because the land is so flat, these slight earthquakes are actually driving river change in the course of the river. Which reminds me of something else that I should mention, which is to return to the point about the evolution of dense species situations in plants. Before the advent of human beings as a cultural force on the planet, the major force, it's thought by evolutionary biologists, which drove plant evolution was the
That was really
meandering
smart of
of
me.
rivers. Because you see, the way evolution works is there is never much of it where there is a highly evolved and integrated ecosystem, because that is a set of interlocking niches, each of which is occupied. The place where evolution takes place is in so-called barren lands, where it's up for grabs, where whoever gets there first has the advantage. This is, and rivers, as they change their course, expose millions of acres every year of bank. And it is this contest for who shall occupy the bank that it was, before the advent of man, the major force driving plant speciation. This is why we have weeds. If you look at what weeds are annular plants which produce thousands and thousands of seeds and which grow very readily. In other words, their strategy for survival is rapid growth and massive seed dispersal. This is a strategy
That
which
one
would
slip
only
up
work
really cost
in
me.
a barren
Jeez.
land or open land situation. It would never work in a primary or climaxed ecosystem of any sort. So, because the Amazon basin is the world's largest river system,
Rookie mistakes.
it has
I'm
that
just,
going
but
for it too,
I'm shaking. I'm getting
driving
the
the engine
cobwebs
of
off. You know, I'm
evolution.
like,
So it is a continental landmass,
go
which
Hunter.
always means
Somebody before a fight,
as
and when they haven't fought
the
in a while, you
potential
know,
for
Krillin,
plant and
Piccolo,
animal
take your pick.
populations expands, there's always a greater potential for evolutionary drift. So that happens more on continents. And then it is equatorial. It's thought that evolution proceeds faster. Well, it's not that it's thought. It's obvious that evolution proceeds faster in the tropics because there can be continuous generations. For instance, in the butterflies or something like that, you don't get one brood a year. You can sometimes get up to 6. Well, each mating season constitutes an opportunity for gene transfer and for the appearance of new characteristics. So this is another factor, the equatorial situation of these continents, of the South American continent and the submerged continent of Indonesia, which presents itself now as an island chain. To return then to the human impact on the Amazon basin and the plant formation, though we cannot pick out the irrigation channeling that has been visible in Quintana Roo, it's probably because of the shifting nature of the river. Lathrop and his co-workers have found kitchen midden soil 1.5 meters deep in various parts of the basin, which indicates very long habitation and extreme sedentariness of the population. In other words, we're not dealing here apparently with hunting and gathering groups. To have kitchen midden soil 1.5 meters deep, people have to settle for several hundred years. It must mean that there's some kind of agriculture, perhaps aquaculture, something like that the North American Indians practiced with wild rices, this kind of thing. So in this situation of very dense speciation, human societies are inimical. We probably arose in this kind of situation, though because humanity presumably arose in Africa, Africa is the most heavily human-impacted continent on a mass scale over long periods of time, so that there is low species count in the forests and large degrees of desertification, this kind of thing. For instance, again, using the side-ranging radar technique, but in a different mode, they were able recently to penetrate through the sands of the southern Sahara up to a depth of about 30 feet because the sand is transparent to radar, and they uncovered river courses that showed that north of what is today the Sahel, the ancient Africa was very wet. And it's in the same area that you get the Tassili frescoes, where you see herders with their cattle and with shaman with mushrooms sprouting all over their bodies in an area now where, you know, a camel is necessary to traverse it. And this has happened very rapidly. So in the tropical situation with the high density of species, man utilizes plants and sifts the environment for foods, for medicinals, and for magical plants. And probably for early human beings, this appeared as an almost continuous spectrum. There were merely effects, the prolongation of life and the extensions of it through interacting with the plants. And of course, everything is animate. Earlier I mentioned the puzzle of how these things came to be known, how they came to be utilized. It's only because we insist on being good 18th century ladies and gentlemen that we pose this puzzle for ourselves and then marvel over it, because there exists in the literature authenticated instances where anthropologists taking hallucinogens with native people have been present when people have discovered alkaloid containing plants by being told by another plant. And this method of discovery, which is irrational and therefore inadmissible by our cultural conventions, is probably the major way in which everything was known up until 500 BC, you know. I mean, these logical and analytical engines by which we place such great store only have come into being really in the last 1,000 years. But before that, we've had our major, perhaps as a species, our major achievements in art, literature, dance, theater, all of these things. So it's a very a culturally conventionalized attitude to demand of these things that they behave rationally. The whole enterprise of anthropology, which seeks to set up, I don't know what, the second-year graduate student as Cambridge as the 0 point, and then measure all forms of humanity against this with various commentary and adumbration, is a very odd notion. I mean, I think if you're going to do serious anthropology related to saving your own soul through finding out about other people, the first thing you have to do is very carefully
More
examine
rookie
the
mistakes.
cultural conventions of your own society. You sort of have to do a deconstruction meditation on the taboos of your own tribe, because they are many and various, let me assure you.
Because I gotta say this, I am in the process of improving. Not just in Tetris, but in life in general. Everywhere. I am pretty high right now. And I'm playing that way because I think that's one of the ways you improve. If you remove yourself from your base state of mind and operate there, and in an attempt to gain like aptitude, it's basically you're training in a different mind state, fucking almost like a different dimension when you think about it. A dimension where you're heavier because you're tired, or your reactions are slower because, again, you're tired or distracted or something. In this case, I'm under the influence of marijuana, and that's what's helping me here. I'm also, whenever I have a chance, I'm not like using my killer instinct here and just going all out, because I'm trying to think differently and find new ways of doing things in Tetris, which you'd think you'd, as long as I've been playing this damn game, decades now, you'd see every permutation and know everything, but we tend to fall into patterns as human beings. I mean, pattern recognition is one of our superpowers. It's one of the reasons eliminate. That's good. It's one of the reasons we are where we are in the food, in regards to the food chain, which is a very simplified idea of what's really going on in nature. But the patterns themselves, I'm glad I didn't lose that string, like Tanjiro. Those patterns can get you stuck. And that's and patterns, I think, is a lot of what life is. Good and bad, and they can be both good and bad. But it's like there's a lot of, just for some reason, whoever designed all this designed it and made patterns a part of it. It's incredible. If everything seems to be fractal when you think about it, that's a whole other can of worms, or a road you could go down, but I probably will at some point, but right now. Improvement. I'm sorry for mouth sounds, by the way, is what we're going for, and that's why I play in the state I do and the ways I do. And sometimes I can't help it. I default into playing my very usual way, and I usually do better then. But I don't really. I don't know if I feel accomplished because then I realized I was like, oh, I just went back into default mode basically. If that makes any sense at all. Probably does not.
I'm sort of getting my second wind here and recovering from my late arrival and realizing that, we're 2/3 in the wrong way back because I didn't get everything set up and all that. But I should have said at the beginning that you can interrupt at any time
And even if
with a
you
question.
clicked in
And
here by mistake
I'm
or
not
just
entirely
passed by
clear
or
on
passing
who
by,
I'm
if I
talking
caught you,
to, whether
tell
I'm
me if
talking
this looks
to
or sounds like shit, please. 'Cause I have
hallucinogen
no idea.
enthusiasts, anthropologists, epidemiologists, psychologists, the police. So maybe at this point, we should let that serve as an introduction and go around the room and let everybody state their concerns, and then I'll pick up the pieces again. Should we do that? Why don't we start here?
Well, I'm interested in the religious aspect that taking some of these drugs have for certain cultures and the effect of it in the development of consciousness.
So comparative religious interest, and so you must be interested in shamanism as the basis of that. Yeah.
About the same as
Same anthropology, the shamanistic angle on hallucinogens. Uh-huh.
Mine is similar. I'm interested in shamanism and what can be revealed through these substances.
Content of the experience. So that's a kind of psychological, phenomenological interest in the situation.
I'm a psychology student here and a psychedelic enthusiast, and I'm really interested in, psychedelics' growth, how they use it in other countries, and also if there's any applications for mental illness treatment with psychedelics.
I'm interested in transformation through beings, through shamanic ways, through pharmacological ways, through whatever that may be, especially the shamanic aspects, and also how that applies psychologically.
I'm interested basically in getting a view of shamanistic practices of South America, especially in ways that they contrast to the practices of this continent.
North American Indian shamanism. Interesting.
I'm a dancer and an artist, and I'm interested in the relationship of all of these things in terms of healing.
Uh-huh. So practical application.
So I'm primarily interested in imagery, psychedelic imagery. Where that's coming from, either the brain or the plant or culture, sorting that out.
The source of the experience, what is it?
I'm interested in East West psychology, and I'm interested in the biological aspects of transformation, also the imagery, to some extent the anthropology.
Uh-huh.
I'm a psychology student here, and I lightly explored shamanism, and I'm on the fringes of being interested in hallucinogens. And I lived in the Andes for a year and a half, and
Oh, you did?
gone down a piece of the Amazon, but I wasn't into exploring the plant life at that time. I just was into the culture, so.
Which piece of the Amazon?
The Napo, which.
Uh-huh. Oh, I know the Napo.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. So did you go from Ecuador down into Peru the whole distance?
No, only really to the kind of the end of the Napo, the, only as far as Lima Cocha.
Oh, on the border.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite a border. Yeah.
I study political science and political sociology, and my theoretical interests with a call it the politics of consciousness. That's my theoretical interest, and my personal interest is that I am an enthusiast is the right word, hallucinogens, but interested in exploring, and my prior experience has been primarily in Mexico.
I'm usually aware when I'm talking to myself. I was talking to myself there. Unironic?
Yes, well, that's one of the richest areas. The two areas where it seems to be concentrated, hallucinogenic shamanism, at least in the present context, is the Amazon basin and central Mexico. Yeah, in the back.
I'm interested in brains, minds, and magic.
He answers the telephone. Well, so everyone must have been pretty bewildered by all that biogeographical.
You'll better find your way.
What was it all for? I just want to say one more thing about it. Geography is the visible condensation of time. It is literally all that we have of time. It's somehow, when you have so much of it that you have to pile it up, you get geography. And time is very much what the psychedelic experience is about. It's about the time of your life, the time of the species, but also the time of the stones. And when I delineated us as being caught between geography and language, that's what I wanted to say. Geography is the most condensed and titanic form of time, and language is the most etherealized and present form of time. And, the trick is to realize that in the way that James Joyce must have realized it, because he understood, that speech makes mountains, which is essentially what I'm saying. And I think this is a shamanic idea, the power of speech and the awareness of eternity. These are the two things, because the shaman really does, I think, when you get it out of Bora and out of, these outlandish languages that are not even literate languages. They've only been assigned alphabets for purposes of study. When you get these concepts out of those languages and into some kind of Platonic or Aristotelian or Hegelian or Heideggerian vocabulary, which we can understand, then you see that that's what it's about. It's about standing in eternity. And this is what gives them their superhuman status. So let me talk a little bit about how I view shamanism generally, and then in the context of hallucinogens.
James, one other thing is, you want to talk more, I hope you're going to talk more a little bit about the differences. It seems like South America is really two completely distinct regional ecosystems, the Andean plateau, and like, if you can, to talk a little bit more about the difference between that and the jungle basin.
Between the montane and the jungle.
And the plant-human interactions.
Right.
Too, and how they differ.
Probably most of you are familiar with Mircea book, Shamanism, the Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. Well, this is the book to read, not because everything it says is true, and in fact I'll delineate my differences with it, but because it represents a compendious phenomenological approach where, without judging, the world is surveyed in an ordered fashion, and the case is actually put in perspective so that we can for the first time see that these diverse magico-religious practices and practitioners that exist all over the world at a certain cultural level and have a certain congruence of belief are actually part of a worldwide proto-historical
I don't even
religious
realize where I
system
placed that time.
that is in
I
fact
know I
probably
feel like I was
the
close.
foundation of all
I didn't
religions,
actually
because once
make
you
a note.
understand the shamanic complex.
note to
It's very easy then to see
check it.
how later religions
Right.
like Hinduism, Jainism, all of them arise on a foundation of shamanic motifs, so that and Iliad investigates and delineates the shamanic motifs, and some of them are superhuman ability to handle fire, shamanic flight, ability to cure, which you mentioned, which is the primary social function of the shaman, which really, I think, puts in perspective the fad of shamanism, which has enveloped our culture recently, because our stress largely, though not entirely, is on what the shaman experiences for himself. But in these societies where shamanism is indigenous, it is for the curing. It's almost as though the vision is the private payoff for being able to cure, and this is the function that the shaman is fulfilling. These superhuman abilities, like ability to handle hot metal, ability to find lost objects, ability to foretell weather, ability to cure diseases, are very challenging to Western anthropology, and they always have been, because we can't quite come to grips with it, and there have been various ideas about it. The most promising ones, I think, leaning on the idea that the linguistic context somehow sets you up for how you perceive reality. But in what exactly this linguistic context consists, we haven't really been able to discover. The linguistic context becomes extremely plastic under the influence of hallucinogens, where, in fact, the word can become flesh, almost literally. And we have to remember, when talking about what you can do with hallucinogens, that our approach is, when we take them, I think, most of us, largely scientific, which is take the drug, do as little as possible. This is known as not interfering with the experiment, and see what happens. And this is a very useful technique. It's the one that I favor most of the time, because I like my life pretty much the way it is and don't seek titanic transformations. But if you take these things and do things, dance, swing through the trees, expose yourself to wilderness isolation, that sort of thing, I think it's pretty clear you can fairly quickly reach a place where other people have very little to say to you, because our reality is a linguistic net which holds us all together. And when you leave the net, you become what is conventionally known as crazy, because you become privy to the workings of a reality which is different from other people's. In India, public displays of madness are completely accepted and conventionalized. And even in the Indian situation, people do not withdraw from public life. They live out their altered state in the teeming urban situation. More attractive to me, and I think illustrating my earlier point that all religious systems have a foundation in shamanism, is the ideal of the Taoist sage who lives on cold mountain and cuts wood and carries water and experiments with minerals and plants and fungi, and is too odd to talk to, too strange to have anything to do with, and he seems to be privy to a superhuman
We will get a win, hopefully. I think so. I feel
life
fairly certain.
that makes his
But it might be a
absence
while.
from court, his lack of property, his lack of family, his celibacy, all of these things don't bring him down, because he is experiencing this internal reality. It's not clear to what degree Taoism and Taoist shamanism
Oh no, I think my
is
camera might be doing that
narcotic.
weird autofocusing again.
Merciliade, or
Hope not.
hallucinogenic. Merciliade uses the word narcotic. One of the places, the major point, in fact, where I differ with him is he believes that all narcotic shamanism is decadent, that the techniques of fasting and ordeal and breath control and the classical, if you will, techniques for invoking visions are precede in time narcotic shamanism, so that by the time a culture turns to a drug, even a plant drug, for the hallucinogenic experience, it's past its cultural peak. But I think that this was just based on not carefully thinking it through and formulating your opinion at a very early point in the history of the collection of the data. Because it's now, I think, pretty well established that hallucinogenic drug-based shamanism is the primary shamanism, and that historically, yeah, and that the evolution of these other techniques has to do with the unobtainability for various cultural reasons of the preferred method of induction, which was a drug. We can, if you want to take a microcosmic case, the entire cultural history of India is haunted by the loss of soma. The pinnacle of Indian civilization, the writing of the Rig Vedas, the production of the Rig Vedas, occurred entirely under the influence and in praise of a plant of some kind called soma, which was the good. And whatever it was, as the people who wrote the Vedas invaded India, their cultural context
I think if I could have fought
shifted,
my way out of that,
and
I
it
would have stood a
became
good
lost,
chance.
and further
But
lost,
you saw how
and
that
further
went.
lost. And I think it would be very easy to make the case that the endless adumbration of techniques for the invocation of ecstasy and vision state in India has to do with this cultural obsession with the recovery of the soma. And similar situation can be seen with the case of Amanita muscaria, which has been held up as the paratypical case of narcotic shamanism, basically because it was the first such case studied in depth by Russian anthropologists who around 1910 to 15 went to the Amur district of far eastern Siberia and studied the Tungusic people who were using Amanita muscaria then. And the so-called classical shamanism that Iliad develops and that he measures all shamanic traditions against worldwide is the Siberian model. It is thought of as the proto-shamanism. It has all the elements, all the motifs are present in it. It's somehow an case of the shamanic complex. At least he wants to take it so. Other people have held different opinions. For instance, Gordon Wasson felt that narcotic shamanism was primary, that in fact the chance encounter with hallucinogenic plants in the environment probably was the driving force behind the formulation of religion, that people working their way through an environment testing plants and eating them would eventually come upon a hallucinogen, and the experience would be so tremendous a ingression of novelty into their ordinary experience that they would immediately cultify the source of the experience and surround it with taboos and ritual, and you're off and running, you know, all the elements are present. This may be true. My brother has wanted to go farther and suggest that consciousness itself may be a kind of self-reinforcing feedback loop, that has to do with hallucinogens in the environment being encountered by monkeys, who then keep taking them, and you know, as you experience a state, you sort of imprint it. These creodes are laid down, and this is perhaps related to what's called flashback, although I'm not sure that I believe that the flashback phenomenon exists. But I think it is true that you can come to think psychedelically in the absence of psychedelic drugs. If you have used them for years and years and years, it just becomes like a style of being. And I think this style of being in the earliest primates developed into what we call civilization, this style of being, of holding ideas, freely commanding images, accessing material in the past, juxtaposing things in novel situations. These may have originally been forms of mental disequilibration that were meaningless to primates. I mean, what is a monkey to do when suddenly a 2-year-old memory of a hunting situation passes through the mind in a state of disequilibrium and confusion? But of course, we can see that the major thing which has given us a leg up on all other plants and animals on the planet is that we think and we draw conclusions, and from those conclusions we put operational procedures into effect so that any agent in the environment which would promote the generation of self-reflection would be, it's like evolutionary super fuel or something. It just gives you a tremendous advantage over every other species. Yes?
How do you suggest this flashback syndrome that people talk about if you don't believe that it is truly...
Well, it's hard for me to believe, you see, that in adipose tissue you could deposit enough of a drug that then 4 or 5 days later some system would cause it all to release all at once at such a level of concentration that you would have some kind of recurring mini trip. I would like maybe seek not a chemical explanation, not exactly, a crude chemical explanation, which is that if you take the drug you might get high again in a few days, but that the experience is so novel that the imprinting of it may have a numinous quality, so that a few days later, in a moment of calm or self-reflection, its numinous quality would allow it to re-emerge quite startlingly in the field of consciousness. That's more my idea of what a flashback must be like. The notion that you would be riding a bus and suddenly realize, my God, I'm getting high on LSD, to me that sounds slightly pathological, but I'm not sure. All I can say is I've taken lots of drugs, and if it happened to me, I would be quite alarmed.
It has the theory of the flashback has the assumption that the experience is caused by the drug.
Right.
So then we have the experience again, you think, oh, it's the drug again, it's left in my body or whatever.
Right.
Whereas most of us don't believe that the experience is caused by the drug. The drug simply releases something that's already there, so once it's been released, it could be released again, or it could be released by other means. And so if you flash back, it just means you're reviewing some memory.
Probably if you studied trauma cases with an eye to this phenomenon, you would discover that people who will say have near automobile accidents or something like that, probably 10% of them within 10 days of the experience have go through a jittery, strong memory, a recurrent. Well, you wouldn't say that's the chemistry of the automobile accident, near miss resurfacing. So it may be that all upsetting, unsettling experiences have the quality to recur with startling vividness sometime later. It's just a way of integrating it or something. Right. Yeah.
Is it a matter of the amount of energy that's been taken up in the process of being conscious that's associated with the particular kind of experience that makes that an altered state of consciousness, as opposed to regular, would you want to explain it in those terms? That whatever is experienced under powerful energy levels will be re-experienced at a certain, or retrieved at the same level. So somehow it's classified under that sort of experience.
Right, it's state-bounded in a certain way, is what you're saying. It's accessible only in the same situation. Perhaps an experience of the flash, or I mean an explanation of the flashback thing would be that it's an effort to integrate the material. It's actually like remembering a dream. Just something sets it off. You say, oh right, last night I had this dream and there was this thing and now it's coming back to me. Well, that's a flashback of some sort, and I believe the orthodox psychoanalytical explanation would be that the compensatory value of the image is being integrated into ego consciousness by the... So this would be a similar situation. Material from the unconscious does have a compensatory role to play if it can be integrated. So it's that kind of thing. So a little bit more about shamanism as a general phenomenon. It relates, and Mircea Eliade again wrote a very interesting book, which very few people seem to have read, called The Forge and the Crucible, which is a study of the relationship of shamanism to alchemy through relating the two figures through the figure of the smith. The smith stands between the shaman and the alchemist, because the smith, the early shaman, alchemist, metallurgist, all these things came together because the ability to handle hot objects is related to the ability to smelt and mold metal, which is related to the ability to create. This is the Hephaestos archetype for any classic scholars. This is the notion of the artificer, and the artificer in the classical traditions, the person who makes things, is always assisted by demons. This is what it means to make things. Technique is the invocation of demons, not necessarily with a pejorative connotation, but as these familiars, which they make these objects for you. They bring them from the other dimension. It's as though they are the minions from the realm of the ideas. And the smith, shaman, alchemist, working with the fire, which is seen as the interface between this world and a higher world of order, brings these things through. And this bringing through of magical objects and magical information was what the early shaman smith was about. Then very early these two things divided, possibly because the making of metal became associated with the shedding of blood, because it came to mean not the forging of implements for agriculture, but the forging of blades for slaughter. And at that point, these things were divided, because there is worldwide the sense that the shaman must be kept from the mundane. The shaman rarely, in war-making societies, the shaman rarely makes war. He's kept back. He has a sacral quality that keeps that from happening.
But it would be involved, for example, helping the food gathering and hunting processes.
That's right. And casting of magic and battle prognostication and all of this.
You can see the enemy coming.
Looking then at narcotic shamanic complexes worldwide, maybe the simplest thing to do would be to survey them briefly and then to talk about the ones that are of particular interest. Starting in the European and Eurasian Arctic, we have, as I mentioned before, this Amanita muscaria cult, which is a very interesting cult to me because it relates to a mushroom, and mushrooms have a role to play that has not yet been fully explicated, even though people like Gordon Wasson and John Allegro and many people have tried to bring it out. but the mushroom shamanic complex appears in two forms in the world. In the Amanita muscaria complex of the Siberian and European Arctic, which is a difficult one. One of the things that's puzzled anthropologists is how hard it is to get high on Amanita muscaria. And you know, people have published compendious books arguing that it was the original soma, and then had to admit that when they took it, it was either inactive or very unpleasant. And so there have been suggestions that perhaps it was prepared in some way, perhaps decarboxylated. The muscarine, which is a poison, can be decarboxylated to muscimol, which is the hallucinogen, through being exposed to milk curds. And in the Vedas there is a lot of allusions to churning and to it is treated somehow. It's churned with milk and extracted. So perhaps this is the way to do it. Other people claim that the mushrooms have to be roasted, toasted, and that somehow then it's pyrolized, and tryptamines pyrolized on the surface of the skin, then become active. I've taken Amanita muscaria a couple of times and found it to be to range from ho-hum to fairly disturbing, with not too much psychedelic activity. The time that I had the most extreme effects, I took it alone in some woods behind Berkeley, and about an hour into it, the only effect I could see, I'm wearing contact lenses by the way, the only effect I could see was that my vision was blurring and blurring and blurring and blurring, and I made this calculation about whether I could walk out before I would be completely non-ambulatory. And I did walk out, and it seemed to reach a plateau of this blurred vision thing. And then I laid down on the ground and closed my eyes, and there was some subthreshold hypnagogia, but it was definitely the small potatoes of hallucinogenesis. Now perhaps more would have been more effective, but these muscarine, that's a symptom of muscarine poisoning, is the blurred vision. So I knew, you know, I was out into it. It seems that it's highly variable geographically and seasonally, so that, and this we'll find in talking about many of these drugs, is a problem, that knowing how to choose, it isn't often only a matter of the plant, but the plant, the time of year, sometimes the time of day, the growth stage of the plant, the variability, signs which account for the variability, and so on. Continuing to look at the Eurasian landmass, here it is, the largest continental landmass existing in the world today, and it's been throughout man's sojourn in the environment extremely poor in hallucinogens. We could almost say that hallucinogens are absent, because you have to really do some concocting to get one together in Europe. European magic, witchcraft so-called, was largely based on solanaceous plants, which contain tropanes, which are psychoactive definitely, but debatably hallucinogenic. They are confusatory and extremely unpredictable and very unpleasant. Any of you who've graduated through the Carlos Castaneda books know the respect that was paid to these solanaceous plants, especially in the first book. They are not, I think, an acceptable hallucinogen for someone seeking self-transformation and understanding. They seem to be spooky, tied up on some lower bardo with the projection and manipulation of other people. I've seen people get into very weird places with it. I had a friend once, when I was studying Tibetan in Nepal, I lived in a Nepali village, and there were acres of Datura metalloides, the conspecific species in Asia to metal in the southwest. And he got quite into it. And one day I was shopping for vegetables in the market, and I met him, and we were talking, and he said, perhaps later I'll see you in the market. And I said, we're in the market. And he said, no, we're not. I'm lying down on my bed. We're talking in my apartment. And I realized, this was a severe case of body image dislocation from the linguistic center. And it was typical. I took it a couple of times and found it very strange. The psychological part, which was quite interesting, was you would wait and slowly form the opinion that it was not working. And as long as you kept your attention focused on it, watching for its approach, it would not boil. But no one can do that for very long. Eventually you begin to think, well, should I go get something to eat, or what's happening? And when your attention would shift, you would fall into like a twilight sleep. And what I saw happening was these things, which were ectoplasmic forms, is the only way I can describe them, came into my window, and they were carrying spreadsheets like newspapers. And these sheets of newspaper would drift down across my lap, and I would read something which would be so amazing that it would jerk me out of the state. And then I would say, what was that? Something, what was it? I can't remember. It was something, and then it would begin to happen again. And this intensified, and this is typical of European witchcraft. They always say the devil, sorry to say, will come and show you an open book.
Was not good.
Read from an open book. And this is, I was definitely getting this. But then, about 40 minutes after that, these things began happening where I would feel the undeniable urge to tie myself in knots, to throw my arm behind my head and my leg over my shoulder, these very tight things, and which would happen very quickly. And then I would find myself in this situation and very consciously unfold myself and lay back down in my mosquito net and just say, and this happened maybe a dozen times. It was, to me, it felt like a sub-convulsion of some sort. I mean, it was very, and I thought to myself at the time, I'm very glad this is happening to me, because I think this would try somebody else's patience to the uttermost, and it's trying mine. So I think this is the kind of thing that Datura is about. It's very unpredictable, very much about your own physiology, varies from species to species, and there are maybe several dozen worldwide of these highly effective solanaceous plants. You're probably all familiar with Jimson weed, Datura stramonium, which formed the basis of a shamanic religion in Southern California before the conquest, the so-called Tolach religion of the Luiseno Indians of Southern California. And on Santa Catalina, there have been digs that exposed hundreds of these capsules in human graves, these seed capsules of the Datura. And definitely the Nepali sadhus were using this. And in Benares, I would occasionally notice in the gutter a cracked pod of this. So it was an item of commerce. It was happening. The atropine-tropane complex can be balanced using other compounds that occur in European plants. So I think European shamanism, European magic, always had this quality of darkness about it, because the plants available were so hard to control, and the expulsive quality of some of these solanaceous compounds caused them to have a role in midwifery, which gives the feminine cast to the shamanism of Europe, and really makes it a kind of a unique case. The only exception to what I've been saying in academic understanding of the role of hallucinogens in European history is the Eleusinian mysteries, and probably you're familiar with Albert Hoffman, Carl Ruck, and Gordon Wasson wrote a book called The Road to Eleusis, in which they argue very, very convincingly that the Eleusinian mystery, which was practiced for over 2,000 years at a cult site south of Athens, was in fact an ergot intoxication, that sacred fields of rye maintained there were infected with a strain of Claviceps purpura, which is the smut of rye, that had fortuitously a very high psychedelic alkaloid content and a very low poison content. And a beer, essentially an ergot-contaminated beer, was being prepared and administered. And I think I was very skeptical when I read the book, and it convinced me completely. I just don't think there's any doubt about it, which really is big news, because it means that our roots, our Grecian roots, go right back to a civilization that had as its centerpiece the psychedelic experience. Joe Fontenrose at Berkeley has studied the Delphic oracles, and though there's less evidence there for a cult of hallucinogen taking, it's fairly clear that the Pythia herself, the prophetess of the cult, was intoxicated on some kind of narcotic. Moving slightly south and far deeper into speculation, you come to John Allegro's ideas about early Christianity and its relation to a mushroom. His book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, makes the case that there never was a person named Jesus Christ, that the entire gospel story is a set of very carefully worded religio-political documents that were drafted around AD 70 to hide a cult of mushroom takers. And what they did is they named their sacrament after an imaginary religious reformer who had lived a generation earlier, who was Christ. And I don't think that Allegro's case is nearly as convincing, but his labor of collecting mushroom words in the Old Testament and of showing mushroom cognates from Akkadian and Sumerian and Attic Greek, it represents a tremendous resource for someone else, I think, to take and construct into a tighter case. Yeah.
What about the use of harmaline compounds through Middle East, North Africa, and Spain?
Well, this is even more speculative than Allegro, because so far as I know, no authority, or even presumed authority, has ever gone into print to say that it was possible, because there is no evidence of current use. But you're right.
Actually, there's a lot of evidence of current use in Persia. You go to any Sufi house and they have usually 2 or 3 pounds of Syrian rue seeds and roots laying around.
And what do they do with them?
Very interesting things.
Well, I know in Pakistan it's used basically as a room fumigant, and it has these Ayurvedic uses. It's very suggestive. I mean, I think, you see, that we're at the beginning of this kind of ethnobotanical archaeology, and that you're very probably right. Syrian rue, for those of you who don't know it, the plant this gentleman mentioned, Pergamon harmala, is the giant Syrian rue, and it occurs from Morocco, basically now probably as far east as Calcutta. And it contains harmine, which is the same alkaloid which is present in the ayahuasca, the major constituent of ayahuasca, which is Banisteriopsis caapi. For years, the constituent of Banisteriopsis caapi was given exotic names like telepathine, banesterine, this and that, until it was finally realized that it was identical to a compound isolated in 1937 by Hochstein and Paradis that was called harmine. Now, several things about this. In South America, the drugs that utilize harmine always do so in combination with another plant which contains DMT. Reports of the activity of harmine on its own are greatly exaggerated. In fact, if you go into the literature, what you discover is it comes down to Claudio Naranjo and one patient, and they described an altered state. It wasn't clear. It was clear that it was psychoactive, but it's not clear that it was hallucinogenic. It seemed to be a kind of enhanced alertness phenomenon. However, this doesn't mean that there couldn't have been a drug prepared in Eurasia that was analogous to ayahuasca in South America. What we have to do is find a DMT plant, a DMT-containing plant that could be combined with the Pergamon harmala to yield a strong hallucinogen. Now, the candidate that I favor is Arundodonax, which is the giant river reed of Asia. Its roots contain DMT in substantial amounts. I have never had the two plants together so that we could actually brew some up and try it. But looking at the published data of the relative concentrations, it looks to me like you should be able to brew a rip-roaring hallucinogen with Arundodonax and Pergamon harmala. Now, it's very suggestive too, because to this day, this plant, Arundodonax in the Arundinaceae, is the preferred source for reeds for musical instruments. All fine reeds are made from Arundodonax, and this suggests a mythological connection. Orpheus, the power of music, the descent into the underworld via the reed. It may be an exoteric symbol of the use of the roots of the reed as a hallucinogen. So, and one last clue, which is among archaeologists, even old-styled archaeologists who know nothing of what I've just said, Pergamon harmala is commonly known as
I think I got the stamina
weed.
in me for one more.
And when you go to Turkey and Anatolia and you're mound hopping, what you look for are patches of Pergamon harmala. It is always found coincident to these mounds that dot Anatolia, southern Turkey, Syria.
There's a couple of other things that you might want to consider. That particular reed, if you read Sufi literature for the last 600 years, it's a major metaphor for their state of consciousness. In Rumi's Masnavi and his Divani Shams, he's constantly going back to the reed and the sound of the reed.
There's a career to be made revealing the existence of this Pergamon harmala plus reed narcotic. It's very old. I'm convinced that it's real. There are even other plants that, there's even a species of Banisteriopsis, Banisteriopsis argregentum, that has DMT in it, according to the one Indian chemist who analyzed it and reported it. Now, this one Indian chemist has been known to make mistakes, but he did publish data indicating that this Banisteriopsis, native to southern India, had DMT in it. So this would be a very fertile problem to take up. There are many fertile problems. As we go through these 2 days, again and again, I hope to be able to say, now here's a problem where someone could make a career by just leaning into this and finding out what is going on. The role of the reed in Egyptian mythology, in Sumerian mythology, in the several cults that have arisen in the marshes at the mouth of the Tigris-Euphrates drainage. The reed seems to me a very potent potential for an undiscovered hallucinogen. Moving south now into Africa, what we find is, as I mentioned earlier, that Africa is the most heavily impacted, human-impacted environment on the planet. Species poor, consequently hallucinogen poor, but tantalizing hints exist that when humanity arose in Africa, it was much wetter, and there was a much wider distribution of plant species, some of which were utilizable. There is one outstanding narcotic complex, hallucinogenic complex in Africa that should be mentioned, and that is the Iboga cults of Gabon and Cameroon. This is Tabernatha iboga, the source of ibogaine, and it is a powerful hallucinogen by repute, and molecularly somewhat different from the others in the family. It hasn't been well studied because it's pretty much the prerogative of men's societies with fairly stringent initiation procedures. What we need is a black French-speaking male anthropologist who is willing to go to Cameroon and live into this thing and find out all about it. The only other plants in Africa that show any promise at all as hallucinogens occur further south. In what is now South Africa, there is among the Hottentots a plant called Gewogdoad. It's Pelospelus nelli, and you occasionally see them sold at nurseries around here. If you know what lithops are, or Mesembryanthemaceae, the so-called stone plants, those are all plants which evolved in the deserts of southern Africa. And this one, Pelospelus bolasi, and the conspecific species Pelospelus nelli, both contain mesembrine, a compound unknown except from the Mesembryanthemaceae, which is a very recently evolved plant group. And Hottentots swear by it. So far as I know, nobody else has ever bellied up to the bar. But that's there to be done, although the political problems of working with black people in South Africa. Yeah, well, I don't know. If we allow in caffeine, we lengthen our list incredibly. Khat is a super caffeine plant that totally obsesses the people of South Yemen and can't even be sold 100 yards across the border where people regard them as mad. No, actually, it has a fairly wide distribution. It's used in Djibouti and along the coast of Aden, a super caffeine plant. The other plant that I will mention now, although I could have mentioned it in talking about Eurasia, is cannabis. Cannabis is in an odd place because I think experientially it is a psychedelic, and that would make it the world's most popular psychedelic. Chemically, it is not an alkaloid, it's a polyhydric alcohol. It arose in Central Asia and has been under human cultivation probably for 7,000 to 10,000 years would be a conservative estimate. And many races have evolved. Some are fiber races, some are resin races. And I think we tend to devalue the power of cannabis because we rarely eat it in large amounts. And I think if you'll look back through the literature of the 19th century on cannabis, for instance, the accounts of Baudelaire or the accounts of Bayard Taylor or Fitzhugh Ludlow, you will see that eating 4 grams of fine Moroccan hashish washed down probably with a little absinthe is quite an experience, and the literary record that is left of it, the literary accounts that we have make it sound pretty indistinguishable from 500 micrograms of LSD, although what they would have thought of 500 micrograms of LSD, I don't know. High-tech and pre-literate people, the people of the Chocó in Colombia, smoke weed, huge bombers, and also these Hottentot people, and well, the history of cannabis use worldwide is fairly well understood, the way it relates to Rastafarianism, the way it relates to Tantric or Shaivite Hinduism, it's a big surprise, I think, to people who study yoga in this country to arrive in India and discover that most yogins in India spend many hours a day making and then consuming chillums, and that this seems to be a major preoccupation of everybody on the spiritual quest.
Excuse me.
Yes.
What are chillums?
Chillums? A chillum is a thing which looks like a cone with the end cut off, and it has a little, you put a little rock in it to block it, and then you mix hashish and tobacco together, and you pack it in, and then you have a little piece of cotton cloth which is wet called a sufi. I don't know if there's anything to be drawn from that or not, but you wrap the sufi across the bottom of the cloth, then you hold it like this, or various ways, and you can get an enormous suction on that, and when they light it, it's a burning surface about the size of a quarter, and you can get a staggering hit off of it. I will never forget the first time I encountered it in its most extreme form, which is I had arrived in Israel, of all places, and it was not where I wanted to be. I was trying to get to Africa, and I thought I would take a bus to southern Israel to Eilat. This was in 1967, and take a boat to Kenya. And when I took this bus to this place and stopped somewhere, and it was nothing, and I went up into the desert, and there were freaks, Danish, Dutch, Colombian, American freaks living in this dry arroyo called the Wadi, which was a place where when it rained it washed down to the Red Sea, but since it hadn't rained for 40 years, people were living in caves in the side of this wadi, and their technique, which I don't think I've ever seen surpassed as a smoking technique, was they would take an orange vodka
made short work of that last
and smash it on a rock, so you get this
pipe down,
neck.
Please. All right, so yeah. As was said, that's it. Wow, I really coasted on somebody else's coattails up to the win that one, huh? I mean, I got 8 KOs. I didn't do shit at the end there. All right, I think this was a successful stream. I think I'm gonna have to watch the playback. It would suck if this entire thing was a big fart, but then that would give me something to start troubleshooting anyway. Yeah, and hopefully I'll be on another platform the next time I stream. I hope you're all doing well and taking care. The world is crazy currently, more so than usual. So yeah, peace and love. Bye.